Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite games with emergent narratives. So let me define that first, because this is a very specific term. An emergent narrative, in my opinion, is a game where the story of the game emerges from the things that you're doing in the game itself, not the written narrative in the game itself. So many games have flavor text, they have storybooks, those are written narratives, and they can have emergent narratives, but because they are directing the story based on the written narrative, they aren't inherently emergent narrative games. An example of an emergent narrative game would be one that doesn't have much of a written narrative at all, and that you can easily explain the game using the theme, and then even remember it and tell the story of the game after you've played, as if you would tell a story. And one quote that I have here is the idea of "and then." So there are many games where you might remember one specific thing that you did in that game, but to actually tell an ongoing narrative, an emergent narrative in the game, you might be telling a story like, okay, I did this in this game, and then I did this, and then this thing happened, and then I did this. That is an emergent narrative of a game that where you're able to tell that story, remember the story of the game, without the game actually just telling you what that story is. So I have some honorable mentions here. These include some ambassador picks and honorable mentions in my opinion, and they include Carson City, Dead of Winter, Battlestar Galactica, Fury of Dracula, Captain Sonar, Obsession. Obsession is the one that I haven't played yet on this list. Terraforming Mars, and Dune Imperium. Some great games there, including one of my favorite games, Dune Imperium, but I left it off a little bit for the emergent narrative, because I was thinking of, can I actually retell the story of these games, and do I remember the games well enough to be able to retell that story? Top 5 honorable mentions, so I have some that came very close to making this top 10 list, are the games We're Doomed, Castles of Mad King Ludwig, which is very different here. Very Euro game there with Castles of Mad King Ludwig, but every time I build the castle, I have the story of the castle, but I don't necessarily have an and then story of the castle, like, and then this happened, then I did this. I don't really have that. I kind of have this complete story of this castle at the end of the game. Flashpoint Fire Rescue, Colt Express, and Western Legends. Western Legends came really, really close to doing this, because even though I think I've only played the game once, but I can remember when I did that game. I just tried to play poker the entire game, but because of my definition here, it wasn't really an and then story. My story of Western Legends was that I tried to play poker the whole game. I don't remember how I played poker. I don't remember if I did well. I don't remember how it had impacted the game, and it was just one specific thing that I was doing. Anyway, let's jump into the top 10 list here. As I've been doing recently, I included one Stonemaier game on the list, right at the bottom, and that is Tapestry Plans and Ploys. Because I think in Tapestry, I kind of designed the game around players having an emergent narrative, specifically in terms of 2 elements. One, the tracks that you're advancing on. So you might tell the story of your civilization where you hardly advance in science at all, but you're a very warfaring society. So you are able to advance to the level of having tanks. But in terms of science, you still are at the most basic level of science. That's part of the story, having that advancing really far on one track and not on another track. And there's also the actual narrative in the game, even though it isn't written, of the tapestry cards that come down and create this story on your player mat of saying, okay, I started out with this marriage of state with player B, and then I decided to go for a full dictatorship. I became a dictator, and then I just focused on I don't know what example here of another tapestry card, but I focused on a militaristic approach right after that. Yeah, I don't have any actual tapestry cards in this specific box, but they actually lay out the story for you, even though you are the one telling that story in terms of which card you play down and how you interact because of playing that card. So Tapestry is my pick for the Stonemaier game with the most emergent narrative elements in it. This was also picked a bunch of times by ambassadors. At number 9 was a really tough one, because number 9 is The King's Dilemma. And I included it low on the list, despite it having an amazing emergent narrative, because The King's Dilemma also has a significant amount of actual written narrative. And so I wanted to focus on games that really have a lot of emergent narrative and less written narrative in the game. And that said, despite the written narrative in The King's Dilemma, I will always remember the story that we created in the King's Dilemma, and I think the game did this It did this in a few specific ways, because our group definitely had our own story, and each of the players in the game told our own story based on what was important to us. And this is what the game, I think, excelled in, because it gave us lots of different things that could be important to us overarching through the entire campaign and at any given moment. For example, each player mat is unique. It's a player shield, really, and it tells the story of your house. And so that's written narrative. It's telling the story of your house. But we really only read that to ourselves maybe once, maybe twice. And then that was just part of who we were for the rest of the game. Like, your house might be really into being loyal. And there was one player at the table who just really got into who their house was supposed to be based on that story. And throughout the game, whenever there was a decision to be made, they based it on what was important for their house. So that was one thing the game gave us. The game also gave us a kingdom to watch over and protect. And for me, that just became the thing that was important to me. It's a competitive game. I didn't really care all that much about winning, but I did care about the fate of this kingdom. And the game gave me this kingdom to look out for and protect together with the other players, even when the other players were acting in their own self-interest at times. The game also gave us just fun, random things to care about. I don't want to spoil any of them, but there were one-time events that happened that the game said, here, if you want to, you can care about this thing, or you cannot. So we had the choice to care about it or not, and they created some of the most memorable moments. And last, I'll add one more, because there are even more in the King's Dilemma, but because of the consequences of your decisions in the King's Dilemma, like one little choice you make can lead to an entire storyline where there is written narrative, but a lot of it comes down to, in terms of the emergent part of it, in terms of that initial decision to do the thing or not do the thing, whatever that might be in the game, to do it or not do it, and the players are deciding whether or not they're going to do it. That decision point that is left up to the players themselves based on limited information and limited story at that point is so pivotal and leads to so many consequences that it's very memorable as to who made the decision and how they made it. And so those reasons and others in the King's Dilemma, I think, led to a wonderful, great emergent narrative in the game. So that's number 9, the King's Dilemma. Probably, almost definitely would have been higher on this list were it not for the large amount of also actual written narrative in the game. Number 8, I put Magic the Gathering. So I recently played the Forgotten Realms version of Magic the Gathering, so I had these cards handy. But Magic, I think, is a game that actually does a really good job with written narrative. Even though it has flavor text, I hardly ever actually read the flavor text. What Magic comes down to is often a few memorable plays and a few memorable cards in the deck that you build. And I'm specifically talking about Magic in terms of drafting, but I think this applies to various forms of Magic as well. But in any game or any draft of Magic that I have, there are a few things that I can look back on, big moments that happened during the game itself that I can remember, and that's the story of the game. That's the story of any game of Magic the Gathering. For example, in this recent draft, Megan's deck, Megan had a hole that creatures could fall into. The game didn't have a story of this hole. There wasn't some big written narrative about this hole, but it was memorable whenever a creature fell into this hole, and Magic created this mechanism that really felt like a hole that was pinning down a creature in the game. Megan also had an owlbear that kept coming out, kept hit and play, this owlbear. And part of it is the name of it. It's an owlbear. It's a common thing in Dungeons & Dragons, but it's also a memorable creature. And it's also a powerful creature. And so whenever it would come out, it'd stay on the table for a while. It would create this ongoing story of this owlbear that was just tearing through opponents. And also, there's a game that I played, Megan, not in this particular draft, but there was a game where I had an amazing start to the game. I threw down a giant creature really early in the game due to some circumstances that let me do that. And Megan immediately stole that creature and attacked me for the win on turn 4. And so that is the story. I'm telling you the story of the game that happened in Magic. The Magic didn't say, okay, this is the story of what's going to happen. This isn't the narrative of this game. That happened because of how we played that specific session and how I built that deck and cards that I played, cards that she played. So that to me is a wonderful emergent narrative, and I think Magic does a wonderful job at that. That's Magic the Gathering at number 8. At number 7, I have Clank. Various versions of Clank. I actually have the box over here, but I didn't feel like lugging it out. It's a pretty big box at this point. Everything's in my Clank Legacy box. Clank Legacy actually does have quite a bit of written narrative. I don't remember all that much of the written narrative in Clank, but any individual session of Clank, I can definitely relay the idea of I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. And I think Clank does that by actually giving you a meeple that you're moving around the board. In most deck building games, it's fairly abstract what you're doing. You're drawing some cards, you're playing some cards, then you're getting rid of those and playing some more cards. But in Clank, the cards that you're playing lead to you actually moving a meeple that represents you around a dungeon. There's a sense of space to it, which I think helps with our memories. Our memories are cued by specific senses of places and spaces. And there's an order to it that matters in Clank. The order in which you move down that dungeon and the order in which you pick up different things matters. I may not remember many of the cards that are in my deck, maybe even very few of them, because in Clank you end up acquiring a bunch of cards. But the dungeon diving element, the dungeon delving element of Clank, I think adds to a lot of the emergent narrative of the story of my particular game in any session of Clank. And I think they've actually done a really good job with their expansions of creating different memorable dungeons that you can go down and explore. There's an Egyptian themed one. There's an underwater one. There's what was the latest one that I did? There's a Dwarven one where you're actually like digging little passages and uncovering more treasure. And so I think all those lead to this emergent narrative of what you did in that specific session. Did you run in and then try to run out quickly? Did you die? Did you move really, really deep into the dungeon to try to grab a really rich treasure and you barely didn't make it out, or you made it out? Those are memorable moments that I cling to. That's why Clank is my number 7. Number 6 is Paleo, one of the most recent games that I've played. This will be followed by 2 games that I haven't played in a long time. 3 games that I haven't played in a long time, which speaks to how memorable they were. But Paleo, I did play very recently for the first time. And right away, I was struck by how good the emergent narrative is in Paleo. Paleo is a cooperative game where you are cavemen trying to survive together. And there is no written narrative at all in the game. I think maybe there's a tiny little bit related to some dream cards, but I think even then, I think maybe it's just depicted in the art. But Paleo has a bunch of different things that come in. So Paleo, for one, avoids written narrative altogether. So it kind of says, we are not going to tell you the story. If you want to tell the story, you can. And in Paleo, you do tell that story because you make a number of decisions that have immediate or long-term consequences based on cards that you I said cards, but I don't even think of them as cards. They're challenges that you're encountering, situations that you're encountering. Like you might say, I'm walking into the woods right now, and I'm hoping to find this, and then you find something else. And that card might be something that you're able to deal with right away, or you might have to put it back in the deck and you have to see it come up later. And so that seeing those cards come up throughout the game leads to this natural story of, oh, there's that giant chipmunk again. How are we going to deal with this thing? How have we not killed this giant chipmunk yet? But also, and I say kill there are many times where you don't have to kill the thing, or you can do something else. And that choice, giving players the choice of how they want to deal with these problems or these things they encounter, also leads, I think, to a nice sense of story. There's also, I mentioned the dreams. I think the dreams add to the story as well. So there are these dreams that come out where you can advance. You're essentially advancing this emergent narrative by adding new things to the deck, new information, new tools, things like that, new ideas essentially. And because there are so few of them in each game of Paleo, they are more memorable. I think that if there were a ton of these that you were going through, they wouldn't be memorable. Because there are very few, I think they add to the memorable aspect of it. But yeah, Paleo I think just does a fantastic job with the emergent narrative side of things. That is Paleo at number 6. And number 5 is a game that is designed for emergent narrative, in my opinion, and that is Call to Adventure. So Call to Adventure is an art-heavy game that, again, avoids much text. There's a little bit of text. Like it tells you in like 3 or 4 words what you're doing or the choices that you have, but it's not then leading to a storybook entry or a bunch of text that you have to read. In Call to Adventure, you are essentially making... often you're making choices between one of 2 options of how you want to proceed, how you want to tell your heroic journey story, or your devilish story, your evil story. That's the light and dark aspect of Call to Adventure. It's been a long time since I played it. I haven't played this game in a long time because it almost really feels like a storytelling game where you are telling your story of your character, but it is a character building game. And And I think it's just built around this idea of emergent storytelling, even as it is applied to different IPs, intellectual properties. So there is like a Stormlight Archives call to adventure. So it's a call to adventure. It's a story that you're telling in the world of the Stormlight Archives, but you're still very much given choices throughout the game, consequential choices. I keep repeating that idea that have memorable moments throughout the game. You've did this, and then you did this, and now you're doing this. And those are choices that you're making, not choices that the game is steering you towards. So yeah, Call to Adventure, I had to include it pretty high up on this list because it is a game designed specifically around this idea of creating an emergent narrative. At number 4, I have a game that is so brutal that it's not one that I get to the table very often, but I think it does a fantastic job at the emergent narrative side of things, and that is Robinson Crusoe. The big thing about Robinson Crusoe, in my opinion, really there are two things I think that lead to a strong emergent narrative. One is how punishing the game is, because there are very difficult things that happen to you throughout the game, very difficult things that you are facing throughout the game. And I think pain and suffering in some way, especially in tabletop games, leaves a mark on our memory. We remember how difficult or how terrible this thing was that happened in the game. That's one thing. The other side of things is the card and event system in Robinson Crusoe. You might draw a card that says, you encounter a hornet's nest. What do? Do you deal with this hornet's nest now? Or do you leave it there for the future? And if you leave it there, you put that card in a different deck and it might come up later and cause you a big problem. But if you deal with it now, it might hurt you right now a little bit, but it might not come up again in the future. And those cards tell such an emergent narrative. Because again, it isn't the game saying, this is the story of your session. It's you making that choice and dealing with the consequence later, or the consequence now as a result. And giving players that ability to make that choice based on thematic information that they have. So it's not just random information. You can see it all right on the card what's going to happen to you. And it's also tied to the theme itself. Naturally, if you leave a hornet's nest hanging up in a tree, it could leave you alone, or it could be a problem later. You can thematically connect to what's going to happen to the mechanisms of the game and the consequences. I think that leads to such a wonderful emergent narrative in Robinson Crusoe. And that's why it's my number 4 pick on this list. At number 3, I have another older game, or slightly older game now that I haven't played in a while, and that is Star Wars Rebellion. So this is a massive 2-player game where you are playing the Empire in Star Wars against the Rebellion. And it just does such a fantastic job with emergent narrative because it's grounded so well in the Star Wars world. You can see the ships, the places, you know these names, you know the characters, but the story is under your control. The game isn't telling you that this is that you do this and then this and then this. You weren't following the narrative of Star Wars. You weren't following the narrative of the game itself. You are making decisions throughout the game, and they are memorable decisions. And I think they're memorable partially largely because of the IP, because we have, at least I have watched the movies many times. I know the Star Wars movies so well, and when I'm playing the game, I can recognize, I can name these characters, I can name these types of ships and these places. So I think that's part of it. But I think the other part of it is because we know the Star Wars story so well, as it's been told to us in the movies, that when we tell a different story, when we tell the opposite story, when Luke turns to the dark side in our game of Star Wars Rebellion, when a Star Destroyer, when the Death Star gets destroyed in the first scene of the game instead of the last scene, we have diverged. We have created our own alternate history of Star Wars in the game itself, and that is really, really memorable, that divergent path. I don't think this works for many games, because not many games have an IP as strong as Star Wars. But when you have a story that is really well known and told many times, and it doesn't have to be a major IP like Star Wars, it could just be a story that we know really well, because like a fairy tale, the type of stories that we all seem to know. If you give players the opportunity to diverge from that story, that becomes memorable. That becomes really memorable, and I think that works so well for Star Wars Rebellion. That's number 3. And number 2, I have a game that's completely different than many of the games on this list, and that is The Pursuit of Happiness. A bunch of ambassadors mentioned this, and I've only played it once, but even just for playing it that one time was a very specific memorable experience. And I actually can't remember it exactly. I have a terrible memory. And so that actually speaks to me that if any of these games have story beats that I can remember in any way with my bad memory, I think that speaks to how good the emergent narrative is in these games. But in Pursuit of Happiness, you are essentially just telling your life as a human, or telling the story of a life of a human that you are embodying for the sake of the game. And every decision in the game, every choice that you can make, every opportunity that presents itself in the game is so connected to a theme that is recognizable, that is connected mechanically, I think, to the types of choices we have to make in real life, that it really just tells the story of a human being. It does it so well in that way, because it's hard for me to even describe how well it does. But I would, if you haven't played Pursuit of Happiness, I would highly recommend it. I think it tells a really, really strong emergent narrative without any written narrative. It's just saying, here are the options for how you could live your life, and here are the consequences of those actions. Here's how high your happiness might be depending on these actions. And it leads you from the beginning of your life, or at least a certain beginning point of your life, to death. The game often ends with your death. There's something about that character arc and the way the game gives you those options and shows you the consequences of you leading a human life that's grounded fairly in reality. I think that makes for a really, really strong emergent narrative. That is The Pursuit of Happiness at number 2. Number 1, you might be able to guess this from recent Instagram posts of mine, but Nemesis is number 1. Nemesis, I think, is another game that is built so strongly around the idea of the emergent narrative. And it does so, again, like many of these games, by completely ignoring and not, almost intentionally not having written narrative. It has good thematic names for things that might happen, for names of items, for names of actions. But a name isn't a written narrative, and it avoids the written narrative altogether, and instead fully embraces in every single component, every single rule of the game. It creates the opportunity for you to have an emergent narrative. It creates the opportunity for you to tell the story of the game. Some examples of this, because I have a long list of what Nemesis does, is the objectives that you choose. The objectives, you have 2 objectives, and at a certain point in the game, you will choose one of those objectives, and a ton of the things that you're doing will be motivated by that objective. The game that I played just a couple days ago, I just wanted the ship to get back to Earth. That was the choice that I made, and I embraced that choice. But I was also the soldier, so I had this asymmetric character. I was the soldier. I was decent at fighting aliens, and I had an obligation. I had the sense of obligation because of my character to turn. Like I was headed towards the armory at one point in the game. I wanted to get to the armory, but I had this obligation because a friend, the scientist, was getting mauled by the Queen. I had this sense of obligation to go and help him because I was the soldier. I didn't need to do that to survive, but that was my role. And so that's another thing. These asymmetric roles in the game, they gave me this sense of, they gave all of us at the table a sense of who we were, a specific character. We can anchor ourselves in one specific character, which I think is actually key for these emergent narrative games. I mentioned this different room, this armory. There was this armory. I can remember different rooms in this layout of the ship. So I think that ties to what I talked about with Clank a little bit, a sense of place, a sense of a space. And also the names of the rooms and the mechanisms of those rooms lead me to remember even what those rooms are in hindsight. Unlike Clank, really, where it's just, maybe it's another crystal cave that I've encountered. I can't remember which crystal cave it was, but in Nemesis, I know specifically I was going after the armory and I couldn't get there, so I had to go back to the surgery room where my friend the scientist was getting mauled by the Queen. The miniatures, I think, play a role in this. I don't know if the character miniatures matter all that much in Nemesis, but having this big queen on the board helps my memory say, oh, that was a queen. I can remember how big it was. I remember how imposing it was. That was the queen that was there. I don't think you need too many fancy components to create an emergent narrative, but a few distinctive ones I think can stand out and can help. The intruder event system, I think, it has an impact on Nemesis's narrative, because sometimes you'll have a miss. A bad thing could have happened and it doesn't, and that's great. Or sometimes a bad thing will happen and bad things, like I said with Robinson Crusoe, are memorable in these games. The types of wounds you get in Nemesis are memorable. We had one character in our last game who got both of his hands chopped off and then his arm, not chopped off, we kind of put that in our heads. That's the Emergent narrative again. I'm telling you the narrative. It just said he had damaged hands and a damaged arm. And so he just kept having these repeated things happen to his hands, even though as a scientist, he really needed his hands. So that stood out as well. The game has environmental changes. There's fire and malfunctions that you have to worry about that mechanically impact the game. And thematically, you look at the table and you're like, oh, wow, we have all these malfunctions that have piled up. That is a memorable bad thing that's happening to the game. The intruders in the game are damaged by fire. So that's a thematic connection in the game. You might try to close some doors around one of the aliens so that they're in a room with a fire and they are getting damaged by that fire. That requires rules overhead to make that possible, make all that possible right there, that the fire deals damage not just to characters but also to intruders. The fact that you can close and open doors, that's a thematic thing that's explained in terms of the mechanisms and vice versa. But all those rules add up to these moments where you actually do close an alien in a room with a fire and the fire is just damaging that alien. Yeah, I could go on. The ship's engines, they can malfunction, they can not malfunction. The ship has a different destination every game. You don't know the destination, you have to go check on it. The intruders have weaknesses that you can research or not research. It's your choice. You can become contaminated and infected by these aliens, and that can lead to different choices. There are various ways that you can lose the game or at least not win the game. All these things. There's a lot of rules that add up in Nemesis, but every single one of those rules contributes to the emergent narrative of the game and your ability to tell the story of what happened when you played Nemesis. I'm just so impressed with what the designer did to make that happen. Because usually with a rule book, if it's a dense rule book with a lot of little fiddly rules, I can easily be annoyed by that. But when it all leads, when I can see the thematic reason, reason for every one of those rules, and when it adds up to a memorable story, it's worth it. All those rules are worth it. There are other games, including some in recent memory, that have a ton of rules like that don't add up to that narrative, and then they seem just like complexity for complexity's sake. But Nemesis doesn't have that. The complexity in Nemesis is there to help you tell that emergent narrative. And that's why it is my number one favorite game with an emergent narrative. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, because I think this is highly subjective. I think we all have different types of games that we can remember and tell a story about afterwards. But I'd love to hear maybe your top 3 games with emergent narratives. And if you feel like typing a little bit, I'd love to hear your story. Tell the story of one of these games. I like to see how players tell that story. It really helps me as a game designer. Maybe it'll help you too as a game designer to see how different people tell the stories of games that end up being memorable for them and what in the mechanisms helped make and craft those memorable moments. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. Thanks.